I used to believe that supporting your partner's journey to better health was the foundation of a strong marriage, until the day I discovered that my husband's newfound flexibility had nothing to do with downward dog poses and everything to do with bending the truth. It happened on a Tuesday morning in our Westlake Hills home in Austin, when I found a receipt that would unravel 8 years of marriage and expose a web of deception that went far deeper than a simple affair. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other in our perfectly curated life. I was Lisa Chen, a 34-year-old marketing director for a tech startup downtown, married to David Martinez, who ran a successful software consulting firm called ZenTech Solutions. We lived in a beautiful 2-story modern home with floor-to-ceiling windows that captured the Texas sunrise, complete with a meditation garden that David had insisted we install after he began his spiritual awakening journey 18 months earlier. I remember standing in our kitchen that Tuesday, watching David prepare his usual post-workout smoothie. He moved with a grace I hadn't seen in our early years together, his once soft programmer physique now lean and defined from his daily yoga practice at Mindful Lotus Studio. His dark hair was still damp from his morning shower, and he wore one of those expensive organic cotton t-shirts that had gradually replaced his collection of tech company promotional wear. "Good session this morning?" I asked, genuinely interested in his transformation. When David first announced he wanted to try yoga, I had been nothing but supportive. His stress levels from running his business had been through the roof, and I thought anything that could help him find balance was worth encouraging. I had even bought him his first yoga mat, a top-of-the-line one from Lululemon that cost more than some people's monthly grocery budget. "Amazing," he replied without looking up from his blender. "Serenity really pushed us through some advanced sequences today. I'm finally getting my bird of paradise pose." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt that familiar flutter of happiness that came from seeing someone you love pursue their passion. Serenity Blake was David's yoga instructor, a woman I had met briefly at a studio open house event about a year ago. She was everything you would expect from an Austin yoga teacher. Flowing blonde hair usually twisted into an effortless bun, sun-kissed skin that suggested she spent as much time outdoors as in the studio, and that particular kind of ethereal beauty that seemed to glow from within. She wore crystals around her neck and spoke in that measured, mindful way that made every word sound like it carried ancient wisdom. At the open house, she had complimented David's commitment to his practice and mentioned how quickly he was progressing. I remembered feeling proud that my husband had found such a dedicated teacher, someone who clearly saw his potential and was helping him grow. She had been warm and welcoming to me, asking about my own wellness practices and suggesting I might enjoy her restorative Sunday classes. "That's wonderful, honey," I said, refilling my coffee mug. "I love seeing how much joy this brings you." And I meant it. The David who had started yoga 18 months ago had been struggling with insomnia, stress eating, and a general sense of being disconnected from his body. The man standing in our kitchen now radiated health and confidence. "I was thinking," David said, finally meeting my eyes, "maybe you should come to one of Serenity's classes. She's been asking about you." This wasn't the first time he had suggested I join him at Mindful Lotus Studio. While I appreciated the invitation, my own fitness routine consisted of early morning runs around Lady Bird Lake and the occasional spin class. Yoga had never quite clicked for me, despite several attempts at various studios around Austin. "You know I'm more of a cardio person," I replied with a smile. "But I appreciate her thinking of me." David nodded, but I caught something in his expression that I couldn't quite place. A flicker of relief, perhaps, or maybe disappointment. At the time, I assumed he was just eager to share something that had become so meaningful to him. As David gathered his things for work, I noticed he was taking extra care with his appearance. His beard was perfectly trimmed, his clothes chosen with more attention than usual. When I mentioned it, he laughed and said that looking professional was important for client meetings. ZenTech Solutions had been growing steadily, and David often spoke about the importance of maintaining a polished image in Austin's competitive tech scene. After he left, I began my own morning routine. I worked from home most days, a perk of my position that allowed me to avoid the downtown traffic that David navigated daily. Our home office was a shared space, with his desk facing the meditation garden and mine positioned near the windows that overlooked our neighborhood. It was in this office that I would later discover the first crack in the foundation of our marriage. I was looking for a receipt to submit for expense reimbursement when I noticed David's laptop bag sitting by his desk. He must have forgotten it in his rush to get to an early client meeting. Inside the bag's front pocket, where he usually kept business cards and charging cables, I found a folded piece of paper that would change everything. It was a receipt from Sacred Grounds Coffee, a popular cafe in South Austin known for its locally roasted beans and cozy atmosphere. The date was from the previous Thursday, when David had told me he was working late at the office. The timestamp showed 2:30 p.m., and the order was for 2 specialty drinks, a turmeric latte and a ceremonial cacao with adaptogenic herbs. Both were expensive, artisanal beverages that suggested an intimate coffee date rather than a quick caffeine fix between meetings. My first instinct was to find a reasonable explanation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Perhaps David had met a potential client there, someone interested in wellness and natural products who would appreciate the cafe's organic offerings. Or maybe he had taken a break from work to try something new, ordering both drinks to decide which one he preferred. I told myself there were countless innocent explanations for this receipt. But as I held the paper in my hands, memories began surfacing that I had previously dismissed. David's increased attention to his appearance, his new vocabulary peppered with Sanskrit terms and wellness jargon, the way he had started meditating for longer periods, sometimes an hour at a time, with a secretive smile on his face that I had attributed to inner peace. The expensive organic supplements that had appeared in our kitchen, items he claimed were recommended by his yoga community. I thought about the changes in our intimate life as well. David had become more adventurous, suggesting new positions and techniques that he said he had learned about through his mind-body connection work. At the time, I had been pleased by his increased interest and creativity. Now, those memories took on a different significance, tinged with the possibility that his education had come from someone other than ancient yoga texts. The receipt also reminded me of conversations we had been having about our future. David had been talking more frequently about the importance of following one's authentic path, about not being trapped by societal expectations or conventional definitions of success. He spoke about people who had found the courage to completely transform their lives, leaving behind everything that no longer served them. I had assumed he was referring to career changes or lifestyle adjustments, not relationship status. There had been subtle changes in his communication patterns as well. David, who had always been an open book about his day, had become more vague about his activities. When I asked about yoga class, he would give general responses about the poses they had practiced, or the philosophical concepts Serenity had discussed, but rarely mentioned specific interactions with other students or detailed descriptions of the sessions themselves. His phone habits had changed too. David had always been casual about his device, leaving it face up on counters and asking me to check messages when he was driving. Lately, he had become more protective of his privacy, taking his phone with him to the bathroom and sleeping with it face down on his nightstand. When I mentioned these observations, he explained that he was trying to be more mindful about technology use, setting boundaries around when and how he engaged with digital communication. The receipt in my hand represented something concrete, a piece of evidence that contradicted the story I had been telling myself about David's transformation. Sacred Grounds Coffee was not on his usual route between our home and his office. It was, however, less than 5 minutes from Mindful Lotus Studio. The expensive specialty beverages suggested a level of intentionality and care that went beyond casual refreshment. I found myself remembering the open house event more clearly. The way Serenity had looked at David when she spoke about his progress. The way her hand had lingered on his shoulder when she adjusted his posture during the demonstration. The way David had seemed to hang on her every word, nodding with an intensity that suggested more than professional interest. At the time, I had interpreted his attention as the enthusiasm of a dedicated student. Now, I wondered if there had been deeper currents I had been too trusting to notice. The timing of the receipt was particularly significant. The previous Thursday had been the day David claimed to be working late on a proposal for a major client. He had texted me around dinner time to say he would be staying at the office until at least 9 o'clock. When he finally came home, he had seemed energized rather than tired, talking about breakthrough moments and new perspectives he had gained. I had assumed his excitement was related to work success. The receipt suggested an entirely different source for his elevated mood. I sat in our home office, holding this piece of paper that felt heavier than it should, and realized how many small details I had been overlooking or misinterpreting. The new clothes that appeared in David's wardrobe, items that were more colorful and flowing than his previous style. The books on tantric philosophy and conscious relationships that had joined his collection of business and technology titles. The way he had started talking about the importance of exploring all aspects of human experience, not limiting oneself to conventional boundaries. Even his language around our relationship had begun to shift. David had always been someone who spoke in definitive terms about our future together, making plans years in advance and expressing certainty about our shared goals. Recently, his communication had become more qualified, peppered with phrases like, "if it feels right," and "following our authentic paths," and "honoring what wants to emerge." I had thought he was simply becoming more spiritually evolved, more open to life's natural flow. Now I wondered if he was unconsciously preparing me for a different kind of emergence altogether. The receipt also made me reconsider David's recent suggestions about our lifestyle. He had been encouraging me to explore my own spiritual practices, to consider what might be calling to me beyond my career and our conventional suburban life. He spoke about the importance of personal growth, of not holding each other back from becoming our fullest selves. While these conversations had seemed supportive and enlightened, I now wondered if they were actually preparation for justifying choices he was already making. I thought about Serenity Blake in a new light, the ethereal yoga instructor who had seemed so genuine and caring now appeared in my memory as someone who might be quite skilled at manipulation. Her interest in David's progress, her compliments about his natural ability, her suggestions about deepening his practice, all of these could be seen as grooming behaviors rather than professional guidance. The spiritual language that had seemed so authentic might actually be a sophisticated seduction technique, using concepts of mindfulness and authentic living to justify betraying commitments and hurting other people. The more I considered the evidence, the more patterns emerged. David's increased interest in workshops and retreats that I was not invited to attend. His new friendships within the yoga community that he described in vague terms. The way he had started questioning traditional relationship structures, suggesting that perhaps monogamy was a social construct that limited human potential. At the time, I had engaged with these ideas as intellectual exercises. Now they seemed like a carefully constructed foundation for justifying infidelity. I realized that I had been so proud of David's transformation, so happy to see him growing and evolving, that I had ignored the possibility that his growth might be taking him away from me rather than bringing us closer together. I had supported his journey without questioning where it was leading or who else might be influencing his direction. My trust had been so complete that I had never considered the need to verify or investigate the changes I was witnessing. Receipt from Sacred Grounds Coffee was more than just evidence of a coffee date. It was proof that David had been living a double life, creating elaborate stories to cover his tracks while maintaining the facade of a devoted husband, exploring spiritual growth. The specialty beverages, the intimate timing, the secret location. All of these details painted a picture of a relationship that had moved far beyond teacher and student, beyond professional guidance and personal development. As I sat in our shared office space, surrounded by the life we had built together, I felt the first real crack in my faith that this was all a misunderstanding. The receipt was tangible evidence that the man I had been supporting and celebrating was not the same man who had been sharing intimate coffee dates with his yoga instructor. The David who came home to me each evening, who spoke about his practice with such passion and gratitude, was apparently living an entirely different story during the hours we spent apart. I carefully folded the receipt and placed it in my wallet, a small piece of evidence that would become the foundation for everything that followed. At that moment, I had no idea how deep the deception ran or how carefully constructed David's alternative life had become. I only knew that the perfect morning smoothie routine, the glowing post-yoga energy, and the spiritual transformation I had been so proud to witness were all part of a performance designed to keep me believing in a marriage that was already over, in everything but name. The house suddenly felt different around me, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets I had been too naive to recognize. Every shared space carried new questions. Every piece of David's yoga equipment represented time and energy that might have been invested in someone else. Every conversation about his spiritual growth now seemed like a calculated misdirection, designed to keep me focused on his evolution rather than his destination. I found myself wondering how long this had been going on, how many receipts and coffee dates and secret conversations I had missed. I wondered if Serenity Blake was simply an opportunist who had recognized a vulnerable married man, or if she was someone more calculating, someone who specialized in helping committed people discover their authentic selves by betraying their existing commitments. I wondered how many other students at Mindful Lotus Studio were going through similar transformations, and how many other spouses were sitting in their offices, holding receipts that would change everything they thought they knew about their lives. The days following my discovery of the coffee receipt became a careful choreography of pretending everything was normal while secretly gathering evidence. I found myself becoming a detective in my own marriage, paying attention to details I had previously overlooked and documenting patterns that had once seemed innocent. The woman who had blindly supported her husband's spiritual journey was rapidly evolving into someone who questioned every word, every gesture, every explanation. I started by creating a timeline in a private notebook I kept hidden in my desk drawer at work. Every evening when David shared stories about his day, I would write down the details he provided, cross-referencing them with his calendar appointments and the location data I could gather from various sources. What emerged was a pattern of inconsistencies that painted a troubling picture of systematic deception. David's yoga classes were supposedly scheduled 3 times per week, Monday and Wednesday evenings and Saturday mornings. However, his location history, which I accessed through our shared family account, showed frequent visits to the Mindful Lotus Studio area on days when no classes were officially scheduled. When I casually asked about these additional visits, David would explain them as private sessions with Serenity to work on specific poses that required individual attention. "She's been helping me with my inversions," he would say, his face lighting up with that familiar enthusiasm. "Some of the advanced poses really need one-on-one guidance to avoid injury." The explanations always sounded reasonable, spoken with the kind of detailed knowledge that suggested genuine expertise. It was only when I began tracking the frequency and duration of these private sessions that the full scope of their relationship became apparent. I discovered that David was spending an average of 8 hours per week at or near the yoga studio, far more than could be accounted for by regular classes and occasional private instruction. Some of these sessions lasted 3 to 4 hours, an extraordinary amount of time for individual yoga practice. When I researched typical private yoga instruction, I learned that most sessions lasted 60 to 90 minutes, making David's extended appointments highly unusual. The financial records told their own story. Our joint credit card statements revealed charges at restaurants and cafes throughout South Austin that David had never mentioned. Expensive organic markets where he was purchasing specialty foods that never appeared in our kitchen. A florist near the yoga studio where he had bought arrangements on 3 separate occasions, none of which had been delivered to our home. When I asked about the flower purchases, David claimed they were for a memorial service for Serenity's grandmother, a story that seemed plausible until I realized the purchases had been made weeks apart. More concerning were the charges at boutique hotels in Austin, specifically places known for their day-use policies and discretionary service. The Austin Motel on South Lamar, a trendy spot popular with locals for afternoon getaways. The Hotel San Jose, an upscale establishment where rooms could be rented for a few hours rather than overnight stays. Each charge was modest enough to avoid drawing attention, but together they painted a clear picture of where David's private yoga sessions were actually taking place. I began paying closer attention to David's appearance when he returned from the studio. The post-yoga glow I had attributed to vigorous physical exercise now seemed more consistent with a different kind of physical activity. His hair was often slightly mussed in a way that suggested it had been thoroughly tousled. His clothes, while technically the same ones he had worn when leaving the house, sometimes bore subtle signs of having been removed and hastily put back on. The faint scent of unfamiliar perfume that I had assumed came from the studio's aromatherapy practice now seemed more personal and intimate. David's phone behavior became increasingly suspicious as I learned to recognize the patterns of his deception. He would receive text messages that made him smile in a secretive way, quickly typing responses while angling the screen away from my view. When I asked who he was texting, he would always have a ready explanation. Another yoga student asking about pose modifications, Serenity sharing inspirational quotes or upcoming workshop information, or members of the studio community organizing carpools or group activities. The vocabulary of wellness and spirituality that David had adopted provided perfect cover for his affair. When he spoke about opening his heart chakra or exploring sacred intimacy, I had initially interpreted these as signs of personal growth and emotional evolution. Now I understood them as euphemisms for a physical relationship with his instructor. The books on Tantra and conscious sexuality that appeared on his nightstand were not abstract spiritual texts, but practical guides for the affair he was conducting. I started following David discreetly, parking in locations where I could observe the yoga studio without being noticed. What I witnessed shattered any remaining illusions about the nature of his relationship with Serenity Blake. On a Thursday afternoon, when David had claimed to be attending a special workshop on meditation and breathwork, I watched as he and Serenity left the studio together, walking closely enough that their hands occasionally brushed. They moved with the easy intimacy of people completely comfortable with each other, stopping to share a lingering embrace before getting into separate cars. The embrace was not the casual hug between teacher and student, but something far more personal and romantic. Serenity's hands rested on David's chest. His arms encircled her waist, and they spoke quietly with their faces inches apart. The conversation lasted several minutes, punctuated by laughter and what appeared to be gentle caresses. When they finally separated, David kissed her forehead in a gesture so tender and familiar that it was clear this was not their first intimate moment. I followed them at a distance as they drove to Sacred Grounds Coffee, the same establishment, where David had purchased the specialty beverages I had discovered in his laptop bag. Inside the cafe, they chose a corner table away from the main seating area, positioning themselves so they could speak privately without being overheard by other customers. Their body language was that of lovers, not professional colleagues or casual friends. Serenity sat close enough to David that she could rest her hand on his arm while they talked. She would lean in to whisper in his ear, causing him to smile with obvious pleasure. David, meanwhile, was completely focused on her, giving her the kind of undivided attention that he used to reserve for our most important conversations. They shared food from the same plate, fed each other small bites, and maintained almost constant physical contact throughout their meal. The most damning evidence came when they prepared to leave. As they stood from their table, Serenity moved naturally into David's arms, and they shared a passionate kiss that lasted long enough to draw glances from other customers. This was not a goodbye kiss between friends, or even a romantic first kiss between new lovers. It was the kiss of two people deeply involved in an established relationship, comfortable with public displays of affection despite the obvious risks. After witnessing this scene, I sat in my car for nearly an hour, trying to process the reality of what I had observed. The man I had been married to for 8 years, the person I had supported through career challenges and celebrated with during successes, was living a complete double life. The spiritual transformation I had been so proud of was actually a cover story for an affair that had clearly been going on for months, possibly longer. I thought about all the evenings David had come home late, claiming to be working on important proposals or attending networking events that would benefit his business. The weekend workshops he had attended alone, explaining that I wouldn't be interested in the advanced spiritual content. The meditation retreats where phones were supposedly prohibited, making him unreachable for entire weekends. Each of these absences now revealed itself as time spent with Serenity, building a relationship that had nothing to do with yoga and everything to do with betraying the vows he had made to me. The financial implications were staggering. I estimated that David had spent thousands of dollars on his secret relationship over the past several months. Hotel rooms, expensive meals, gifts, and experiences that I had assumed were legitimate. Business or wellness expenses were actually investments in his affair. Money that should have been saved for our future or used to improve our shared life had been diverted to support his deception. More painful than the financial betrayal was the emotional manipulation I had endured. David had not simply fallen into an affair. He had constructed an elaborate framework of lies to maintain it, while keeping me unknowing and supportive. He had used my trust and love against me, turning my encouragement of his personal growth into a tool for his deception. Every conversation about his yoga practice had been an opportunity for him to practice his lies, refining his story and testing my reactions to ensure his secret remained safe. I began to understand that Serenity Blake was not simply an opportunistic yoga instructor who had seduced a vulnerable married man. She was someone who understood exactly what she was doing, using the language and concepts of spiritual practice to justify and facilitate an affair. The private sessions she offered were not legitimate yoga instruction, but opportunities for physical intimacy. The workshops and special classes David attended were cover stories for romantic dates and weekend getaways. The more I learned about their relationship, the more I realized how carefully they had planned their deception. They had created an entire alternative reality where their affair could flourish under the guise of spiritual development and professional instruction. The wellness community provided perfect cover for their activities, with its emphasis on personal growth, authentic living, and following one's true path. They could justify their relationship as a natural evolution of David's spiritual journey, a connection that transcended conventional relationship boundaries. I discovered that Serenity had a history of becoming involved with married students. Through careful research and discreet conversations with former students, I learned that David was not her first affair within the yoga community. She had a pattern of identifying emotionally vulnerable married men and gradually drawing them into increasingly intimate relationships. The spiritual teachings she offered were deliberately designed to undermine traditional commitments, encouraging her students to question conventional relationship structures and explore alternative forms of connection. The evidence I gathered painted a picture of a systematic seduction that had been months in the making. Serenity had identified David as a potential target during his early days at the studio, recognizing his stress, his marital dissatisfaction, and his openness to new experiences. She had gradually increased the intimacy of their interactions, moving from group classes to private sessions to personal conversations about his deepest desires and frustrations. The philosophy she taught was specifically crafted to justify infidelity. She spoke about the importance of honoring one's authentic desires, of not being limited by social conventions that might prevent personal growth. She framed traditional marriage as a potentially restrictive institution that could prevent individuals from reaching their full potential. Under the guise of spiritual wisdom, she provided a framework for David to rationalize betraying his commitments to me. I realized that my own supportive response to David's transformation had inadvertently enabled his affair. By encouraging his yoga practice and celebrating his personal growth, I had given him the freedom and confidence to pursue his relationship with serenity. My trust had created the perfect environment for his deception, allowing him to maintain his secret life without fear of discovery or confrontation. The psychological manipulation extended beyond just facilitating the affair. Serenity had gradually altered David's perception of our marriage, helping him to identify problems and dissatisfactions that justified his need to seek fulfillment elsewhere. She had coached him to see me as someone who might be holding him back from his true potential, someone who represented the conventional life he needed to transcend in order to become his authentic self. This process of gradual alienation explained the subtle changes I had noticed in David's behavior toward me. His increasing criticism of conventional lifestyle choices, his suggestions that I might benefit from exploring my own authentic path, his comments about the importance of not holding each other back from personal growth. All of these had been planted by Serenity as part of a long-term strategy to justify ending our marriage. I came to understand that the affair was not just about physical attraction or temporary infatuation. It was part of a comprehensive reconstruction of David's identity and values, carefully guided by someone who specialized in helping married people transition into new relationships while maintaining a sense of spiritual and moral justification. Serenity was not just David's lover. She was his guide in abandoning the life we had built together. The revelation of this systematic manipulation filled me with a rage I had never experienced before. This was not a simple case of two people falling in love despite existing commitments. It was a calculated campaign of deception and emotional abuse designed to destroy my marriage while making me complicit in my own betrayal. The very qualities that made me a good wife had been weaponized against me, turned into tools for maintaining David's secret life. As I continued gathering evidence, I began to formulate a plan for confronting both David and Serenity. I would not simply accept the dissolution of my marriage or allow them to control the narrative about what had happened. The spiritual community that had provided cover for their affair would also serve as the stage for exposing their deception. If they wanted to use wellness and authenticity as justification for their betrayal, I would show that community exactly what kind of authentic behavior they had been celebrating. The woman who had once trusted blindly was becoming someone who verified everything. The wife who had supported unconditionally was learning to protect herself strategically. The spiritual seeker who had believed in the inherent goodness of people was discovering that some individuals use sacred concepts to justify the most profane behaviors. My own transformation was beginning, and unlike David's apparent evolution, mine would be built on truth rather than lies. I spent weeks documenting every detail of their relationship, building a comprehensive case that would leave no room for denial or manipulation. Photos of their public displays of affection, records of their hotel visits and expensive dates, screenshots of text messages and social media interactions that revealed the depth of their emotional connection, financial records showing the systematic deception that had funded their affair. More importantly, I began to understand the broader pattern of how Serenity operated within the Austin wellness community. Her method was sophisticated and repeatable, designed to identify vulnerable married individuals and gradually separate them from their existing commitments. She used the language of personal growth and spiritual evolution to justify behaviors that were fundamentally destructive to families and relationships. The studio itself was carefully designed to facilitate these transitions. Private rooms where individual instruction could become intimate encounters, workshops and retreats that provided cover for extended affairs. A philosophy that questioned traditional commitments while encouraging exploration of alternative relationship structures. Even the scheduling was designed to accommodate married students, with sessions available during typical work hours when spouses would assume their partners were engaged in legitimate professional activities. I realized that David and I were not Serenity's only victims. There were other couples in our social circle who had experienced similar patterns of transformation and separation. Marriages that had ended shortly after one partner began attending Mindful Lotus Studio. Divorces that had been justified as spiritual evolution and authentic living. A network of former students who had left their families to pursue new relationships within the wellness community. The scope of the damage Serenity had caused was staggering. Not just individual affairs, but a systematic undermining of committed relationships throughout Austin's yoga and wellness scene. She had created a pipeline from marriage to separation, using spiritual concepts to justify and facilitate the destruction of families. The private sessions, the specialized workshops, the philosophy of authentic living were all components of a carefully designed system for breaking up marriages. This understanding transformed my anger from a personal grievance into a sense of mission. Exposing David's affair was no longer just about my own betrayal. It was about protecting other families from experiencing the same systematic deception. The evidence I was gathering would not only reveal the truth about my marriage, but also demonstrate the broader pattern of manipulation that Serenity had perfected. As I prepared for the confrontation that would change everything, I knew that I was not just fighting for my own dignity and truth. I was taking on an entire system of deception that had been allowed to flourish under the cover of spiritual practice and personal growth. The woman who had once believed that supporting her partner's journey was the foundation of marriage was about to discover that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is expose the lies that are destroying not just your own relationship, but the relationships of countless others. The moment of truth arrived on a humid Wednesday evening in late September, when David announced he would be attending a special tantric workshop at the studio that would run until nearly midnight. He spoke about it with the same enthusiasm he had shown for all his yoga activities, describing it as a breakthrough opportunity to explore advanced energy work and consciousness expansion. The workshop fee was $300, which he said was worth it for the transformational experience Serenity had promised. I had already confirmed through my research that no such workshop was scheduled at Mindful Lotus Studio that evening. The studio's website and social media accounts showed their regular Wednesday evening schedule with no special events listed. When I called the studio's main number that afternoon, pretending to be interested in attending the tantric workshop, the receptionist had no knowledge of any such event and suggested I might be thinking of a different studio. This was the confrontation I had been preparing for over the past month. Every piece of evidence I had gathered, every inconsistency I had documented, every lie I had verified would come together in this moment. I had rehearsed what I would say and how I would handle David's inevitable denials and deflections. More importantly, I had developed a strategy that would expose not just his individual betrayal, but the entire system of deception that Serenity had constructed. Instead of confronting David directly about the non-existent workshop, I decided to follow him and gather the final evidence I needed. I waited until he left the house, then drove to a location near the yoga studio where I could observe without being detected. As expected, David parked near Mindful Lotus but never entered the building. Instead, he walked 2 blocks to the hotel, San Jose, the same upscale establishment where he had charged several previous encounters. I watched as Serenity arrived 10 minutes later, moving through the hotel lobby with the confidence of someone completely familiar with the venue. She was dressed more provocatively than I had ever seen her, wearing a flowing dress that accentuated her figure and jewelry that caught the light as she moved. This was not the modest spiritual teacher I had met at the studio open house, but a woman prepared for a romantic evening with her married lover. Rather than continuing to spy on their meeting, I implemented the plan I had been developing. I drove directly to Mindful Lotus Studio, where I knew the evening classes would be in session. The parking lot was full of cars belonging to legitimate students attending actual yoga classes, people who were genuinely seeking the physical and spiritual benefits that David claimed to be pursuing. I entered the studio and approached the front desk, where a young woman named Ashley was managing registration and answering questions. I had spoken with Ashley several times during my research, always under the pretense of being interested in classes for myself. She recognized me immediately and greeted me warmly, asking if I had finally decided to try one of their offerings. "Actually," I said, "I'm here about something more serious. I need to speak with whoever manages the instructor certification and professional standards for this studio." Ashley's expression shifted from welcoming to concerned, and she asked if there was a problem she could help address. I explained that I had concerns about the professional conduct of one of their instructors and needed to speak with someone in a supervisory role. Ashley disappeared into the back office and returned with Marcus Rivera, the studio owner and director. Marcus was a man in his 50s who had founded Mindful Lotus 10 years earlier as part of Austin's growing wellness community. He had a reputation for running an ethical practice and had spoken publicly about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries in teacher-student relationships. I introduced myself as the wife of one of Serenity's students and explained that I had discovered evidence of an inappropriate relationship between my husband and his instructor. Marcus immediately became serious, asking me to join him in his private office where we could speak confidentially. The walls of his office were covered with yoga certifications, professional development certificates, and photos from various workshops and retreats. "These are very serious allegations," Marcus said after I had outlined the basic situation. "If what you're describing is accurate, it represents a fundamental violation of our professional standards and ethical guidelines." He explained that all instructors at Mindful Lotus were required to maintain strict boundaries with students, and that romantic or sexual relationships were explicitly prohibited by their certification requirements. I presented Marcus with a carefully organized folder containing the evidence I had gathered over the past month. Credit card statements showing charges at hotels and restaurants during supposed yoga sessions. Photos of David and Serenity in intimate embraces outside the studio. Screenshots of text messages that clearly indicated a romantic relationship. Financial records showing the pattern of deception that had funded their affair. Marcus examined each piece of evidence with growing concern and anger. He explained that Serenity had been one of their most popular instructors, highly regarded by students and colleagues for her knowledge and teaching ability. However, he acknowledged that there had been occasional concerns raised about her relationships with male students, complaints that had been investigated but never substantiated with concrete evidence. "What you've documented here goes far beyond anything we've seen before," Marcus said, shaking his head as he reviewed the financial records. "This represents a systematic abuse of the teacher-student relationship and a complete betrayal of the trust our community places in our instructors." He assured me that immediate action would be taken, including a formal investigation and likely termination of Serenity's teaching position. I explained that my concerns extended beyond just David's affair. Through my research, I had identified several other married students who had experienced similar patterns with Serenity, suggesting that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a deliberate pattern of behavior. I provided Marcus with names and contact information for other potentially affected families, asking him to investigate whether there were additional violations that had gone unreported. Marcus was genuinely shocked by the scope of what I was describing. He had built Mindful Lotus as a place of healing and growth, and the idea that one of his instructors had been systematically manipulating students and destroying marriages was devastating to him personally and professionally. He immediately began making phone calls to other studio owners in Austin, warning them about Serenity's behavior and sharing the evidence I had provided. The investigation that followed moved rapidly. Within hours, Marcus had contacted 3 other married men who had been taking private sessions with Serenity. 2 of them admitted to inappropriate relationships when confronted with the evidence, while the third revealed that Serenity had made advances that he had rejected. All 3 men confirmed that Serenity had used similar techniques of gradually undermining their marriages while positioning herself as a guide to authentic living. One of the men, a software engineer named Robert, described how Serenity had convinced him that his marriage was preventing him from reaching his spiritual potential. She had gradually introduced concepts about the limitations of monogamy and the importance of exploring all forms of human connection. The private yoga sessions had evolved into discussions about his relationship dissatisfaction, then into physical intimacy that she framed as spiritual practice. Robert had ultimately ended his affair with Serenity when he realized how much damage it was causing to his family, but not before his wife had discovered the relationship and filed for divorce. He expressed gratitude that someone was finally holding Serenity accountable for her actions, explaining that he had been too ashamed to report her behavior, despite knowing that other men were likely being similarly manipulated. The second man, James, was still in the early stages of his relationship with Serenity when the investigation began. He had not yet crossed physical boundaries, but admitted that Serenity had been gradually leading him in that direction. The techniques she used were sophisticated and subtle, designed to make him feel that his growing attraction to her was a natural part of his spiritual development rather than the result of deliberate manipulation. James described how Serenity would schedule his private sessions during times when his wife was at work, ensuring that their meetings remained secret. She would gradually increase physical contact during pose adjustments, introduce topics about sacred sexuality and tantric practice, and encourage him to question whether his marriage was aligned with his highest spiritual purpose. The process was so gradual that he had not recognized it as seduction until the investigation forced him to examine their interactions more critically. The evidence from these additional cases revealed that Serenity had developed a sophisticated system for identifying and targeting vulnerable married men. She would observe new students carefully, looking for signs of marital stress, career pressure, or general life dissatisfaction. Men who seemed open to spiritual exploration and personal growth were gradually drawn into deeper relationships with the studio and with Serenity personally. The progression was always similar. Group classes would lead to suggestions for private sessions to address specific physical or spiritual needs. Private sessions would evolve into extended conversations about life philosophy and personal fulfillment. Gradually, Serenity would introduce concepts that questioned traditional relationship structures and encouraged exploration of alternative forms of connection. Physical boundaries would be eroded slowly, with each step justified as part of spiritual practice or personal growth. Marcus shared this information with the Austin Yoga Community's professional organization, which immediately began its own investigation. Serenity's teaching certifications were suspended pending a formal review, and other studios where she had worked were notified about the allegations. The response was swift and decisive, with the entire wellness community rallying to address what was clearly a serious breach of professional ethics. While this investigation was unfolding, I finally confronted David about his deception. I waited until he returned from his supposed tantric workshop, noting that he arrived home at exactly the time he had predicted, despite the fact that no such workshop had taken place. His demeanor was relaxed and satisfied, consistent with someone who had spent the evening in intimate company rather than engaged in rigorous spiritual practice. "How was the workshop?" I asked casually, curious to see how elaborate his fabrication would be. David launched into a detailed description of the evening's activities, describing breathing exercises and energy work that he claimed had created profound shifts in his consciousness. He spoke with the same enthusiasm and apparent authenticity that had characterized all his previous lies about his yoga practice. I listened to his elaborate fiction for several minutes before presenting him with the evidence I had gathered. I placed the folder of documentation on our kitchen table and watched as his expression changed from confidence to confusion to panic. The credit card statements, the photographs, the timeline of deception, all of it laid out in undeniable detail. "I know about Serenity," I said simply. "I know about the hotels, the restaurants, the fake workshops, all of it. I know that your spiritual transformation has been a cover story for an affair that's been going on for months." David's face went pale as he realized the extent of what I had discovered and documented. His first response was denial, claiming that I had misunderstood the evidence and that his relationship with Serenity was purely professional and spiritual. He insisted that the intimate photographs were taken out of context and that the hotel charges were for legitimate wellness sessions that required privacy. The explanation sounded hollow even to him, lacking the conviction that had made his previous lies so convincing. When denial failed, David shifted to justification. He spoke about the profound connection he had discovered with Serenity, describing it as a spiritual bond that transcended conventional relationship categories. He claimed that their relationship had helped him discover his authentic self, and that trying to limit it to traditional boundaries would be a betrayal of his personal growth. The language he used was clearly borrowed from Serenity's manipulation, framing the affair as a positive spiritual development rather than a betrayal of our marriage. I listened to his justifications with a mixture of anger and sadness, recognizing how thoroughly Serenity had reconstructed his understanding of commitment and authenticity. The man I had married would never have spoken about betraying our vows as a form of spiritual progress. The David sitting across from me had been systematically reprogrammed to see deception as liberation and infidelity as enlightenment. "Do you understand that she's done this before?" I asked, presenting him with the evidence about Serenity's other affairs. "You're not special, David. You're not her spiritual soulmate. You're just the latest in a series of married men she's manipulated using exactly the same techniques." I showed him the statements from Robert and James, demonstrating the pattern of behavior that had destroyed multiple families. This revelation shattered David's romantic narrative about his relationship with Serenity. The idea that he was part of a spiritual awakening unique to their connection was replaced by the reality that he was simply another victim of a predatory instructor who specialized in breaking up marriages. The philosophical framework that had justified his affair crumbled when he realized it was a template that had been used repeatedly with other students. David's reaction to learning about Serenity's pattern of behavior was devastating to witness. The confident, spiritually evolved man who had been justifying his affair minutes earlier collapsed into someone who realized he had been systematically manipulated and deceived. He understood that every meaningful conversation, every moment of intimacy, every spiritual revelation had been carefully orchestrated by someone who viewed him as just another conquest rather than a genuine partner. The confrontation continued for hours as David processed the reality of what had happened to him and to our marriage. He began to recognize how Serenity had gradually altered his perceptions and values, helping him to see problems in our relationship that justified seeking fulfillment elsewhere. The spiritual teachings that had seemed so profound were revealed as sophisticated manipulation techniques designed to separate him from his existing commitments. He also began to understand the financial cost of his deception. The thousands of dollars he had spent on hotels, meals, and gifts for Serenity represented money that should have been invested in our shared future. The private yoga sessions that cost hundreds of dollars each had not been professional instruction, but expensive affairs that had depleted our savings while destroying our marriage. Most painfully, David realized how his transformation had affected me. He saw that my support for his spiritual journey had been turned against both of us, making me an unwitting accomplice in my own betrayal. The trust and encouragement I had offered had been weaponized by Serenity to create the perfect environment for conducting their affair without fear of discovery. As the night progressed, David's anger shifted from defensive justification to genuine rage at how he had been manipulated. He began to understand that Serenity was not the enlightened spiritual teacher he had believed her to be, but a predator who used sacred concepts to justify destructive behavior. The woman who had promised to help him discover his authentic self had actually led him away from his true values and commitments. By morning, David was ready to join me in exposing Serenity's systematic abuse of her position and her students. He provided additional evidence about their relationship, including text messages and emails that clearly showed her manipulation techniques. He also agreed to cooperate with the investigation that Marcus had initiated, adding his testimony to the growing case against Serenity. The revelation that even David had been a victim of manipulation, rather than an equal partner in the affair, provided a new framework for understanding what had happened to our marriage. While his choices to lie and betray our vows remained inexcusable, the systematic nature of Serenity's manipulation added context that explained how a fundamentally decent person had been led so far from his values. This understanding would become crucial as we moved forward, providing a foundation for rebuilding trust while ensuring that Serenity faced consequences for the damage she had caused to multiple families throughout Austin's wellness community. The crisis that had threatened to destroy our marriage was becoming an opportunity to expose a much larger pattern of abuse and manipulation. The weeks following our confrontation became a period of intensive rebuilding that tested every aspect of our relationship and our individual characters. David's complete cooperation with the investigation against Serenity marked the beginning of what would become the most difficult and ultimately transformative period of our marriage. The man who had spent months living a double life was now committed to absolute transparency, sharing every detail of his deception while working to understand how he had been so thoroughly manipulated. David's first step toward making amends was providing Marcus with comprehensive documentation of his relationship with Serenity. He turned over all text messages, emails, and photographs that detailed their affair, creating a timeline that revealed the sophisticated progression of her manipulation. The evidence showed how Serenity had gradually introduced concepts that undermined his commitment to our marriage, while positioning herself as his guide to authentic living. The investigation expanded rapidly as other victims came forward with similar stories. A marriage counselor named Dr. Patricia Williams contacted Marcus after hearing about the case through Austin's wellness community network. She explained that she had been treating several couples whose marriages had been destroyed by affairs that followed the exact pattern we had documented. In each case, one partner had become involved with alternative wellness practitioners who used spiritual concepts to justify infidelity. Dr. Williams had been documenting this pattern for over 2 years, noting how certain instructors and healers in Austin's wellness scene seemed to specialize in helping married individuals transition out of their existing relationships. She had tried to raise concerns with various professional organizations, but without concrete evidence, her warnings had been dismissed as overreaction to isolated incidents. The documentation we had provided gave her the proof she needed to demonstrate that this was a systematic problem. Working with Dr. Williams, we discovered that Serenity was part of a loose network of wellness practitioners who shared techniques for identifying and manipulating vulnerable clients. They attended the same advanced training workshops, studied under teachers who promoted radical relationship philosophies, and often referred clients to each other when local relationships became too complex or risky to maintain. This network operated throughout Texas and beyond, with practitioners in Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, who used similar methods to separate married individuals from their spouses. They positioned themselves as spiritual guides and healers, while systematically undermining committed relationships under the guise of promoting authentic living and personal growth. The scope of the operation was far larger than anyone had realized. The evidence we uncovered revealed that these practitioners specifically targeted successful professionals who were experiencing midlife transitions or career stress. They looked for individuals with substantial financial resources who were questioning their life choices and open to dramatic personal transformation. The yoga studios, healing centers, and wellness retreats where they worked provided perfect hunting grounds for identifying potential targets. Dr. Williams helped us understand the psychological techniques that made Serenity's manipulations so effective. She used a combination of love bombing, where she showered David with excessive attention and validation, followed by intermittent reinforcement that kept him emotionally dependent on her approval. She gradually isolated him from his existing support systems while positioning herself as his primary source of wisdom and guidance. The spiritual framework she employed was particularly insidious because it corrupted concepts that were genuinely valuable for personal growth. Authentic living, mindful awareness, and conscious relationships are legitimate spiritual principles that can enhance life and relationships when applied ethically. However, Serenity twisted these concepts to justify behaviors that were fundamentally selfish and destructive. David's willingness to examine how he had been manipulated was crucial to our healing process. He worked with Dr. Williams to understand the specific techniques that had been used against him, recognizing how his legitimate desires for personal growth and deeper meaning had been exploited. This understanding helped him distinguish between genuine spiritual development and the sophisticated manipulation he had experienced. The process of rebuilding trust required David to demonstrate sustained changes in his behavior and values. He voluntarily provided me with complete access to his phone, email, and financial accounts, understanding that transparency was essential for rebuilding the foundation of our relationship. He also began attending individual therapy to address the psychological factors that had made him vulnerable to manipulation. David's therapy revealed that his susceptibility to Serenity's influence was rooted in deeper issues related to his sense of identity and purpose. The stress of running his business had created feelings of disconnection from his authentic self, making him hungry for the kind of validation and spiritual guidance that Serenity provided. Understanding these underlying vulnerabilities was essential for preventing similar manipulation in the future. Meanwhile, the legal and professional consequences for Serenity mounted rapidly. The Austin Yoga Alliance formally revoked her teaching credentials and issued warnings to other studios about her conduct. Several of her former students filed complaints with the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, which began investigating whether her behavior constituted professional misconduct under state regulations governing wellness practitioners. The financial damage Serenity had caused was also becoming clear. David's affair had cost our family nearly $15,000 over 6 months, money that had been diverted from our savings and retirement accounts to fund hotels, meals, gifts, and the expensive private sessions that were actually romantic encounters. This financial betrayal was particularly painful because it represented resources we had been saving for our future together. I decided to pursue civil litigation against Serenity for the financial damages her manipulation had caused. Working with an attorney who specialized in professional misconduct cases, we built a lawsuit that could potentially recover our losses while establishing legal precedents that might protect other families from similar exploitation. The case would also create public records that could warn potential victims about predatory wellness practitioners. The lawsuit alleged that Serenity had violated her professional duties by engaging in inappropriate relationships with students while misrepresenting the nature of her services. We argued that the private sessions David had paid for were fraudulently marketed as yoga instruction when they were actually romantic encounters. The case also included claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress based on the systematic manipulation that had destroyed our marriage. Preparing for the lawsuit required us to document every aspect of the affair and its impact on our lives. This process was emotionally devastating, but also therapeutic, forcing us to confront the full extent of the damage while creating a comprehensive record that could help other victims. We worked with financial experts to calculate the monetary losses and with therapists to document the psychological harm. The discovery process in the lawsuit revealed additional evidence of Serenity's pattern of exploitation. Her business records showed that nearly 40% of her income came from private sessions with married male students, a percentage that was far higher than typical for legitimate yoga instruction. Her appointment calendar revealed that these Sessions often lasted 3 to 4 hours and frequently took place at off-site locations, confirming that they were not professional instruction. We also discovered that Serenity had been charging premium rates for her private sessions, often 2 to 3 times the going rate for legitimate yoga instruction in Austin. She marketed these sessions as advanced spiritual guidance and tantric instruction, using language that was deliberately ambiguous about what services were actually being provided. The pricing structure suggested that clients were paying for access to her personally rather than for professional instruction. The investigation revealed that Serenity had earned over $200,000 annually from her private sessions, far more than most yoga instructors in Austin. This income level was only possible because she was providing services that went well beyond traditional yoga instruction. The financial records proved that she was essentially operating an escort service disguised as spiritual instruction. Other yoga studios began conducting their own investigations after learning about Serenity's behavior. 3 additional studios in Austin discovered evidence that she had engaged in inappropriate relationships with students while working for them. Several instructors came forward with stories about Serenity making unprofessional advances toward married students and using spiritual concepts to justify boundary violations. The wellness community's response to these revelations was swift and decisive. Professional organizations throughout Texas implemented new ethical guidelines and reporting procedures to prevent similar exploitation. Training programs for yoga instructors began, including specific modules about maintaining appropriate boundaries and recognizing signs of predatory behavior among colleagues. David threw himself into supporting these reform efforts, speaking at professional development workshops about how he had been manipulated and what warning signs other students should recognize. His willingness to share his story publicly, despite the personal embarrassment it caused, helped educate the wellness community about sophisticated manipulation techniques and their devastating consequences. Our marriage counseling with Dr. Williams focused on rebuilding trust while addressing the underlying issues that had contributed to David's vulnerability. We learned new communication techniques that allowed us to discuss difficult topics without falling into patterns of defensiveness or blame. Dr. Williams helped us understand that healing from this betrayal would be a long-term process requiring sustained commitment from both of us. One of the most challenging aspects of our recovery was learning to distinguish between legitimate spiritual growth and the corrupted version that Serenity had promoted. David needed to rediscover authentic practices that could support his personal development without undermining our relationship. We began exploring meditation and mindfulness practices together, ensuring that his spiritual journey supported rather than threatened our marriage. The support we received from our friends and family was crucial during this difficult period. My best friend Rachel provided emotional support and practical help as we navigated the legal proceedings and therapy. She also helped me recognize my own strength and resilience, reminding me that surviving this betrayal demonstrated my capacity to handle whatever challenges life might bring. David's business partner Mark initially struggled to understand how his rational, analytical friend had been so thoroughly deceived. However, as he learned more about sophisticated manipulation techniques, he became one of David's strongest supporters. Mark helped David recognize that being vulnerable to emotional manipulation didn't reflect weakness or stupidity, but rather a capacity for trust and connection that had been exploited by an expert predator. The process of rebuilding our relationship required us to essentially start over in many ways. We had to rediscover who we were as individuals and as a couple, free from the lies and manipulation that had corrupted our recent history. This meant questioning assumptions we had developed about each other and our relationship while being open to growth and change. We established new traditions and routines that supported our healing while creating positive shared experiences. Weekly date nights where we practiced honest communication. Morning walks around Lady Bird Lake where we could connect with nature and each other. Regular check-ins about our emotional states and relationship satisfaction. These practices helped us rebuild intimacy while maintaining the transparency that was essential for trust. David's commitment to making amends extended beyond just our relationship. He reached out to Robert and James, the other men who had been manipulated by Serenity, offering support and sharing resources for healing. These connections evolved into an informal support group for men who had been victimized by predatory wellness practitioners, providing mutual understanding and encouragement for recovery. The group met monthly at a community center in Austin, facilitated by Dr. Williams, and focused on education and healing. Members shared their experiences, learned about manipulation techniques, and developed strategies for maintaining healthy boundaries in future relationships. The group also worked to raise awareness about predatory behavior in wellness communities, speaking at workshops and conferences throughout Texas. As our legal case against Serenity proceeded, we learned that she was facing multiple lawsuits from other victims and their families. The financial and professional consequences were mounting rapidly, making it clear that her predatory behavior would have lasting consequences. However, the most important outcome was not punishment, but prevention, ensuring that other families would be protected from similar exploitation. The transformation in our marriage was profound and unexpected. The crisis that had nearly destroyed our relationship ultimately forced us to develop deeper levels of honesty, communication, and mutual support than we had ever achieved before. We learned to value authenticity over perfection, substance over appearance, and genuine connection over spiritual pretense. David's experience with manipulation also made him more empathetic and emotionally intelligent. He developed better skills for recognizing and responding to emotional manipulation in all areas of life, from business relationships to family dynamics. The painful lessons he learned through his affair with Serenity ultimately made him a better husband, father, and friend. Our recovery process taught us that healing from betrayal requires more than just time and forgiveness. It demands active work to rebuild trust, honest examination of underlying issues, and commitment to sustained change. The couple that emerged from this crisis was stronger and more resilient than the one that had been torn apart by deception and manipulation. The courtroom was packed on the morning our civil case against Serenity Blake went to trial. What had begun as a personal quest for justice had evolved into a landmark case that would reshape how Texas regulated wellness practitioners and protected consumers from emotional and financial exploitation. Reporters from Austin's major newspapers and local television stations filled the gallery, recognizing that this trial would expose systematic abuse within the city's thriving wellness industry. Our attorney, David Martinez, had built a compelling case that went far beyond the simple affair between David and Serenity. The evidence we had gathered, combined with testimony from other victims and expert witnesses, painted a picture of deliberate fraud and professional misconduct that had enriched Serenity while destroying families throughout Austin. The trial would determine not only whether we could recover our financial losses, but also whether predatory wellness practitioners could be held legally accountable for their manipulation. Serenity appeared in court with her own legal team, funded by the substantial income she had earned from her network of private clients. She had hired expensive attorneys who specialized in defending alternative healing practitioners against misconduct allegations. Their strategy was to portray her as a dedicated spiritual teacher who had simply formed personal connections with students that extended beyond traditional professional boundaries. The opening statements revealed the fundamental conflict at the heart of the case. Jennifer argued that Serenity had systematically defrauded clients by misrepresenting sexual services as spiritual instruction while deliberately targeting married men to maximize emotional and financial exploitation. Serenity's defense attorney countered that she was a legitimate spiritual teacher whose personal relationships with consenting adults had been unfairly criminalized by jealous spouses who couldn't accept their partner's authentic spiritual growth. The first phase of the trial focused on establishing the pattern of Serenity's behavior across multiple victims. Robert, the software engineer whose marriage had been destroyed by his affair with Serenity, testified about the gradual progression from legitimate yoga instruction to sexual manipulation. His testimony was particularly powerful because he had documented many of his sessions with recordings and written notes, creating an audio record of how Serenity used spiritual language to justify increasingly inappropriate behavior. Robert described how Serenity had initially presented herself as a traditional yoga instructor focused on helping him develop physical flexibility and mental clarity. Over several months, their sessions evolved to include discussions about his marriage and personal fulfillment. Serenity gradually introduced concepts about the limitations of monogamous relationships and the importance of exploring all forms of human connection as part of spiritual development. The recordings Robert had made revealed Serenity's sophisticated manipulation techniques in her own words. She could be heard encouraging him to question whether his marriage was aligned with his highest spiritual purpose, and suggesting that his attraction to her was a sign of spiritual awakening rather than simple infidelity. The audio evidence was devastating because it captured the deliberate nature of her manipulation without any possibility of misinterpretation. James, the second victim who had been in the early stages of being seduced when our investigation began, provided testimony about Serenity's recruitment and grooming process. He described how she identified potential targets by observing which students seemed emotionally vulnerable or dissatisfied with their lives. She would then gradually increase personal attention and introduce private sessions as opportunities for deeper spiritual work. James's testimony revealed that Serenity maintained detailed notes about her students' personal lives, including information about their marriages, finances, and emotional vulnerabilities. These notes, which were discovered during the legal discovery process, showed that she approached potential affairs with the same systematic planning that a business executive might use to develop marketing strategies. Each student was carefully analyzed for his susceptibility to manipulation and his potential value as a long-term source of income. The financial evidence presented during the trial was equally damning. Expert witnesses analyzed Serenity's business records and demonstrated that her income from private sessions was far higher than what legitimate yoga instruction could generate. The pricing structure for her services was deliberately complex and ambiguous, making it difficult for clients to understand exactly what they were paying for until they were already emotionally invested in the relationship. Dr. Patricia Williams testified as an expert witness about the psychological techniques Serenity had used to manipulate her victims. She explained how spiritual bypassing, love bombing, and intermittent reinforcement had been combined to create psychological dependencies that were difficult for victims to recognize or escape. Dr. Williams's testimony helped the jury understand that the men who had affairs with Serenity were not simply weak-willed individuals who had chosen to cheat on their wives, but victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation. The defense attempted to portray Serenity as a dedicated spiritual teacher whose personal relationships with students were consensual and separate from her professional duties. They argued that alternative spiritual practices often involved intimate connections that mainstream society might not understand, and that judging these relationships by conventional standards was culturally biased and legally inappropriate. Serenity's attorneys brought in their own expert witnesses who testified about the legitimate role of physical touch and emotional intimacy in certain spiritual traditions. They argued that tantric practices and sacred sexuality were ancient, spiritual paths that naturally involved close relationships between teachers and students. The defense suggested that Serenity's accusers were simply uncomfortable with non-traditional spiritual practices and were using the legal system to enforce their conservative relationship values. However, this defense strategy backfired when Jennifer presented evidence that Serenity had never received legitimate training in tantric practices or sacred sexuality instruction. Her certifications were in basic yoga instruction and general wellness coaching, with no specialized training in the advanced spiritual practices she claimed to be teaching. The defense's own expert witnesses were forced to admit that Serenity lacked the qualifications to safely or ethically provide the services she was offering. The trial also revealed the extensive network of predatory practitioners that Serenity was connected to throughout Texas and beyond. Investigators had discovered that she regularly attended workshops and retreats where manipulation techniques were shared among wellness practitioners who specialized in separating married clients from their spouses. These gatherings operated under the guise of advanced spiritual training, but actually functioned as networking events for individuals who profited from relationship destruction. Email evidence showed that Serenity and her colleagues shared information about successful manipulation strategies and referred clients to each other when local relationships became too complex to maintain. The network operated with the efficiency of a business organization, complete with mentorship programs for new practitioners and profit-sharing arrangements for successful referrals. The scope of the operation shocked even experienced investigators, who had been tracking fraud in the wellness industry. David's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. He described in detail how Serenity had gradually separated him from his values and commitments, while convincing him that his growing attraction to her was a sign of spiritual evolution. His testimony was particularly powerful because he took full responsibility for his choices, while clearly explaining how sophisticated manipulation had influenced his decision-making process. David explained how Serenity had used his legitimate desire for personal growth as a weapon against his marriage. She had helped him identify genuine areas where he wanted to improve himself, then gradually convinced him that achieving these improvements required abandoning his existing relationships and commitments. The process was so gradual and seemingly logical that he had never recognized it as manipulation, until our investigation forced him to examine her techniques objectively. The defense cross-examination of David was aggressive and personal, attempting to portray him as a man who had simply chosen to have an affair and was now trying to avoid responsibility by blaming his spiritual teacher. They questioned his intelligence and integrity, suggesting that anyone who could be so easily manipulated must have been a willing participant who was now fabricating stories to save his marriage. However, David's honest acknowledgement of his poor choices and his detailed explanation of the manipulation process actually strengthened his credibility with the jury. He never attempted to minimize his responsibility for betraying our marriage, or to portray himself as a completely innocent victim. Instead, he explained how legitimate spiritual seeking had been exploited by someone who specialized in using people's highest aspirations against them. My own testimony focused on the financial and emotional damage that Serenity's manipulation had caused to our family. I presented evidence of the money that had been diverted from our savings to fund David's affair, as well as documentation of the therapy costs and legal expenses we had incurred as a result of her actions. The financial impact was substantial, but the emotional damage was even more significant. I described how Serenity's manipulation had not only destroyed my trust in David, but also undermined my faith in the wellness community that I had once valued. The spiritual practices and alternative healing modalities that had been corrupted by predatory practitioners were things that had genuinely helped me in the past. Serenity's abuse of these practices had poisoned my relationship with entire categories of healing and growth that had been important parts of my life. The trial also included testimony from Marcus Rivera, the owner of Mindful Lotus Studio, who described how Serenity had systematically violated the ethical standards that governed his business. Marcus explained that yoga instruction, like other helping professions, required strict boundaries between teachers and students to prevent exploitation. He had trusted Serenity to maintain these boundaries and felt personally betrayed by her abuse of the platform he had provided. Marcus's testimony revealed that Serenity had deliberately sought out teaching positions at studios with affluent clienteles and married students. She had specifically targeted environments where she would have access to financially successful men who were experiencing stress or transitions that made them vulnerable to manipulation. Her choice of teaching locations was not coincidental, but part of a calculated strategy for maximizing her access to potential victims. The defense attempted to discredit Marcus by suggesting that he was simply trying to protect his business from liability by blaming Serenity for problems that were inherent in the yoga industry. They argued that intimate relationships between teachers and students were common in wellness communities, and that Marcus should have known about these relationships if he was properly supervising his staff. However, Jennifer was able to demonstrate that Marcus had implemented appropriate oversight procedures and that Serenity had deliberately concealed her inappropriate relationships from studio management. The evidence showed that she scheduled her private sessions at off-site locations specifically to avoid detection, and that she had coached her victims to keep their relationships secret from studio staff and other students. The expert testimony about the financial fraud aspects of the case was particularly compelling. Forensic accountants demonstrated that Serenity had systematically overcharged for services while misrepresenting what those services included. The analysis of her business records revealed that she was essentially operating two different businesses: legitimate yoga instruction for most students, and expensive sexual services disguised as spiritual guidance for carefully selected married men. The pricing analysis showed that Serenity's victims had paid an average of $300 per session for what they believed was advanced yoga instruction. Comparable legitimate services in Austin typically cost between $60 and $100 per session. The premium pricing was justified through claims about specialized training and exclusive spiritual guidance that Serenity did not actually possess. The financial expert testimony also revealed that Serenity had structured her business to maximize tax avoidance, while making it difficult for victims to understand what they were paying for. She used complex billing arrangements and vague service descriptions that obscured the true nature of the transactions. This evidence supported the fraud claims by demonstrating deliberate deception in her business practices. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Serenity herself took the witness stand in her own defense. Her attorneys had advised against this decision, but Serenity insisted that she needed to explain her spiritual philosophy and defend her teaching methods. Her testimony revealed the depth of her narcissism and her complete lack of remorse for the damage she had caused to multiple families. Serenity testified that she considered herself a pioneer in advanced spiritual instruction, who was being persecuted by people who couldn't understand the profound nature of her work. She described her relationships with married students as sacred connections that transcended conventional relationship boundaries. She claimed that she had actually helped these men discover their authentic selves and that their wives' objections were based on jealousy and spiritual immaturity. Under cross-examination, Jennifer systematically dismantled Serenity's defense by forcing her to acknowledge the specific techniques she had used to manipulate her victims. When confronted with recordings and written evidence of her manipulation, Serenity was unable to maintain her facade of spiritual wisdom. Her responses became increasingly defensive and contradictory, revealing the calculating mindset behind her supposedly enlightened teachings. The most damaging moment in Serenity's testimony came when Jennifer asked her to explain why all of her advanced spiritual instruction students happened to be married men with substantial financial resources. Serenity's inability to provide a credible explanation for this pattern exposed the predatory nature of her targeting process. Her claim that these relationships developed naturally was completely contradicted by the evidence of systematic victim selection. Jennifer also confronted Serenity with evidence of her connections to the network of predatory practitioners throughout Texas. When shown emails discussing manipulation techniques and victim referrals, Serenity claimed that these communications had been taken out of context. However, the volume and consistency of the evidence made it clear that she was part of an organized effort to exploit vulnerable individuals through spiritual deception. The defense's closing argument attempted to portray the case as an attack on religious freedom and alternative spiritual practices. They argued that Serenity was being punished for teaching non-traditional approaches to spirituality and sexuality that challenged mainstream cultural norms. They suggested that the real issue was not fraud or manipulation, but cultural prejudice against practices that some people found uncomfortable or threatening. However, Jennifer's closing argument effectively countered this defense by emphasizing the evidence of systematic deception and financial exploitation. She pointed out that legitimate spiritual teachers don't need to lie about their qualifications, misrepresent their services, or deliberately target married individuals for financial exploitation. The issue was not cultural prejudice, but consumer fraud and professional misconduct. Jennifer's closing emphasized the broader implications of the case for protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation by unqualified practitioners who use spiritual language to justify harmful behavior. She argued that allowing Serenity to escape accountability would send a message that predatory practitioners could operate with impunity as long as they claimed spiritual motivations for their actions. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a unanimous verdict in our favor. They found that Serenity had committed fraud, professional misconduct, and intentional infliction of emotional distress through her systematic manipulation of vulnerable students. The monetary damages awarded included reimbursement for all financial losses, plus punitive damages designed to deter similar behavior by other practitioners. More importantly, the verdict established legal precedents that would make it easier for other victims to pursue justice against predatory wellness practitioners. The case demonstrated that spiritual or healing services could be subject to the same consumer protection laws that governed other professional services. The ruling also clarified that consent obtained through systematic manipulation was not legally valid consent. The trial's impact extended far beyond our individual case. Within months, Texas had implemented new regulations governing wellness, practitioners that required clear disclosure of qualifications and services. Professional organizations throughout the state adopted stricter ethical guidelines and reporting procedures to prevent similar exploitation. Several other states began developing similar regulations based on the precedents established in our case. The Austin wellness community underwent significant changes as a result of the trial and subsequent investigations. Studios and healing centers implemented better screening procedures for instructors and clearer boundaries around teacher-student relationships. Professional development programs began, including specific training about recognizing and preventing predatory behavior among colleagues. Several other predatory practitioners in Serenity's network were exposed and faced their own legal consequences. The network that had operated with relative impunity for years was systematically dismantled as victims came forward with evidence and law enforcement agencies began treating spiritual fraud as seriously as other forms of consumer deception. Our marriage emerged from this ordeal stronger than it had ever been before. The process of fighting for justice together had created a deep bond based on shared values and mutual support. We had learned to communicate honestly about difficult topics and to work together to protect our relationship from external threats. The transparency we had developed during our recovery became a permanent feature of our marriage. David's experience as a victim of manipulation made him an effective advocate for other survivors. He began speaking at conferences and workshops throughout Texas, sharing his story to help people recognize the warning signs of spiritual exploitation. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes while explaining how sophisticated manipulation worked helped reduce the shame and isolation that many victims experienced. I found my own calling in supporting other families who had been torn apart by predatory practitioners. Working with Dr. Williams and other professionals, we developed support groups and educational programs that helped survivors heal while teaching people how to safely explore spiritual and wellness practices. The network we created became a model for similar programs in other states. The financial recovery from our lawsuit allowed us to rebuild our savings and invest in our future together. More importantly, the legal victory provided closure and validation that helped us move forward without the lingering resentment that might have poisoned our relationship. We knew that we had not only recovered from the damage Serenity had caused, but had also helped prevent similar damage to other families. David's business also recovered and thrived as he applied the emotional intelligence he had developed through his healing process. His experience with manipulation made him better at reading people and situations, skills that proved valuable in business relationships. The integrity he had rebuilt in our marriage extended to all areas of his life, making him a more trustworthy partner and leader. Our relationship with the spiritual and wellness community evolved in positive ways as well. We learned to distinguish between legitimate practitioners who maintained appropriate boundaries and those who used spiritual concepts to justify harmful behavior. This discernment allowed us to continue benefiting from practices that supported our growth while protecting ourselves from exploitation. The support we received from our friends and family during this ordeal strengthened those relationships as well. People who rallied around us during our darkest moments became even closer friends, while those who judged us or failed to provide support revealed themselves as fair-weather relationships that weren't worth maintaining. The crisis served as a filter that helped us identify our true community. 3 years after the trial, we learned that Serenity had left Texas and was attempting to rebuild her practice in Colorado under a different name. However, the legal precedents established, in our case, and the network of survivors we had built made it much more difficult for her to operate with impunity. When reports of her activities reached Colorado authorities, they were able to intervene quickly before she could establish a new network of victims. The ongoing impact of our case continued to protect other families throughout the region. Law enforcement agencies had developed better procedures for investigating spiritual fraud, and professional organizations had implemented effective oversight mechanisms. The culture of accountability we had helped create made the wellness community safer for everyone seeking legitimate healing and growth. Our story became part of the curriculum at several universities that trained counselors, social workers, and law enforcement professionals. The case study helped future professionals understand how spiritual manipulation worked and how to support survivors of such exploitation. The educational impact ensured that our experience would continue protecting people for years to come. Looking back on the journey from discovery to recovery to justice, I realized that the woman who had found that first receipt in David's laptop bag was fundamentally different from the person I had become. The naive trust that had made me vulnerable to deception had been replaced by wisdom and discernment. The passive support I had once offered was transformed into active partnership and mutual protection. David's transformation was equally profound. The man who had been susceptible to manipulation because of his disconnection from his authentic self had become someone who knew his values deeply and defended them consistently. His spiritual seeking continued, but it was now grounded in integrity and transparency rather than escape and fantasy. Our marriage had been forged in crisis and tempered by justice. The relationship that emerged was not the same one that had been threatened by Serenity's manipulation, but something entirely new and stronger. We had learned that true authenticity meant honoring our commitments while supporting each other's growth, not abandoning our responsibilities in pursuit of selfish desires. The yoga mat that had started David's journey into deception was eventually replaced by a meditation practice we shared together. The spiritual growth we both sought was found not in the arms of predatory teachers, but in the daily work of building a life based on honesty, integrity, and mutual respect. The flexibility we developed was not physical, but emotional, learning to bend without breaking when life presented unexpected challenges. The guest bathroom in our Westlake Hills home, which had never played a role in our story, became a symbol of the clarity we had gained. Unlike the original tale of displacement and exclusion, our experience had taught us that true belonging comes from authentic connection rather than mere proximity. The home we shared was not just a physical space, but a sanctuary built on truth and defended by justice. As we looked toward the future, we knew that our experience had given us tools and wisdom that would serve us well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The ability to recognize manipulation, the courage to seek truth even when it was painful, and the commitment to protect not just ourselves but others from similar harm had become permanent parts of who we were. The story that began with betrayal and deception had become one of resilience and justice. The marriage that had nearly been destroyed by spiritual fraud had been rebuilt on a foundation of authentic spiritual values. The community that had harbored predators had been transformed into one that protected the vulnerable and celebrated genuine healing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.